In a silent courtroom where justice was about to be served, a man in an expensive suit trembled before the highest chair in the chamber. His eyes widened in horror as he recognized the face of the magistrate who would decide his fate, the same man he had thrown out of his restaurant like a stray dog weeks before. How could he have imagined that this humble janitor, dressed in dirty work clothes, was actually the judge who now wielded the hammer of justice over his head? The city of Millbrook awakened as always, with the noise of cars and the movement of honest workers who built their livelihood with their own hands. Among them walked Robert Thompson, a 62-year-old man of elegant bearing even under his orange janitor's uniform. For 3 decades he had swept these same streets, knowing every stone in the pavement, every tree that shaded the avenues. His colleagues respected him for his quiet wisdom and the dignified way he performed his work, always impeccable, always punctual. What they didn't know was that Robert carried with him an extraordinary story. A law school graduate 40 years ago, he had been a respected attorney until a family tragedy forced him to abandon everything to care for his sick wife and young children. When she passed away, he was already too far from the courtrooms, but he never abandoned his legal studies, keeping up with every change in legislation, every new jurisprudence, secretly nurturing the dream of one day returning to the legal profession. On the other side of town, in an upscale restaurant called Sterling's, owner Marcus Sterling adjusted his Italian tie while inspecting each table with a critical eye. Heir to a fortune built by his grandfather, Marcus had transformed the simple family diner into a sophisticated establishment where only the elite of the city felt comfortable. At 45, he had developed an arrogance that made him judge people by the thickness of their wallets and the brand of their clothes. To him, poor people were a stain on society, inferior beings who should stay away from decent folks. His employees feared him, his suppliers avoided him, but his wealthy clientele adored him, feeding his prepotence even more. Not far from there, in an austere courthouse office, presiding Judge Dr. Henry Morrison fought against aggressive cancer that consumed his strength day by day. At 70 years old with 40 years on the bench, he knew his days as a judge were numbered. For decades, he had observed society with growing disillusionment. Corruption spread like weeds, justice was bought by the powerful, and the humble were trampled without mercy. He had become cynical, embittered, convinced that honesty was a virtue of fools. In his final months of life, he would need to choose a temporary replacement for some important cases, someone from the list of retired judges who could be called upon. Ironically, on the list was the name of Robert Thompson, who had passed the judicial examination 3 decades before but never assumed the position due to family circumstances. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, do it now so you don't miss any incredible stories like this one that's just beginning. The storm that hit Millbrook that cold Tuesday in July seemed to foreshadow the extraordinary events that were about to unfold. Robert was finishing his usual shift when the rain began to fall heavily, soaking his clothes already tired from the day's work. Walking down Main Street, he caught the comforting aroma emanating from Sterling's. For months he hadn't tasted a hot meal prepared by hands other than his own. With the few bills he carried in his pocket, exactly $22, he decided he deserved this small luxury. After all, he had worked honestly for it. As he pushed through the glass door of the restaurant, Robert was greeted by the cozy warmth of the environment and the civilized murmur of well-dressed customers. A few heads turned in his direction, and he could perceive the disapproving looks. Even so, he maintained his dignity, approaching the counter where Marcus was checking a table's bill. "Good evening," said Robert with the calm and respectful voice he always used. "I'd like to know if I could order some soup to go." Marcus looked up from the bill, and his expression instantly transformed into a grimace of disgust. There was a dirty man, smelling of the street, staining the refined environment he had worked so hard to build. "Are you kidding me?" said Marcus, raising his voice purposely so everyone could hear. "This is an establishment for decent people, not a place for beggars and panhandlers." "Sir, I have money," Robert replied serenely, showing the crumpled bills. "I'd just like to buy some soup. I can pay." Marcus's reaction was even more violent. "Dirty janitor money isn't worth anything here. You're embarrassing my customers." He pointed to the tables, where some patrons indeed seemed bothered. "People like you should eat garbage scraps from dumpsters, not in family restaurants. Get out of here before I call the police." The silence that followed was deafening. Robert felt each word like a stab, but his dignity remained intact. He put the money back in his pocket and headed for the door, but before leaving he turned one last time. "You have the right not to serve me, but you don't have the right to humiliate me. One day, perhaps you'll learn that true nobility isn't in the clothes we wear." Nobility. Marcus laughed loudly, provoking nervous laughter from some customers. The only thing noble about you is your broom. Now get out of my sight. He literally pushed Robert outside, slamming the door hard. Outside, under the freezing rain, the janitor stood still for a moment, letting the drops wash not only his face but also the humiliation he had just suffered. That same night, while Robert arrived home wet and hungry, 3 waiters from Sterling's made a decision that would change everything. Tired of Marcus's constant mistreatment, public humiliations, and delayed wages, they sought out a labor attorney. The complaints were serious: moral harassment, degrading working conditions, non-payment of overtime, and a series of irregularities that could shut down the establishment. The lawsuit was filed the following Friday. 2 weeks later, Dr. Henry Morrison received his latest medical tests in his office. The cancer had spread more than doctors expected. He would have at most 2 months to live and would need to step down from his position immediately. That same day, the labor lawsuit against Sterling's restaurant arrived on his desk. By an irony of fate, it would be one of the last important cases to pass through his hands, but he wouldn't have the strength to handle it. Consulting the list of available substitute judges, his eyes stopped on the name Robert Thompson. He vaguely remembered him, a brilliant young man who had passed first place in the judicial examination decades ago but never assumed the position. Out of morbid curiosity, he decided to investigate. He discovered that Robert had kept his Bar Association membership active all these years, continued studying, and was technically still qualified for the position. In an impulse he couldn't explain himself, he decided to summon him. When the official letter arrived at Robert's modest home, he couldn't believe it. After 30 years sweeping streets, fate was offering him a second chance to practice his dream profession. But there was a problem. The first case he would judge was exactly the lawsuit against Marcus Sterling. Robert spent the night awake, wrestling with his conscience. Would he be able to judge impartially the man who had humiliated him? Could he separate the judge from the offended janitor? At dawn, he had made his decision. He would take the case but would deliver true justice, based only on law and facts, not personal revenge. If you're enjoying this incredible story, hit that like button to support the channel. The Monday that would change everything forever dawned gray in Millbrook. Marcus Sterling woke up nervous, knowing he would face the most important trial of his life. His expensive and renowned lawyers had guaranteed the case would be easily dismissed. Interim judge, probably retired and without energy to complicate things, they said. We'll handle it. Marcus would wear his best suit, bring his most expensive jewelry, make sure to show his status and economic power. After all, it had always worked that way. Money spoke louder than justice. Robert, meanwhile, prepared himself with the solemnity of someone about to realize a dream delayed for 3 decades. He wore the only dark suit he owned, the same one he had worn to his wife's funeral, and headed to the courthouse with his chest tight with emotion and responsibility. On the way, he passed the same streets he had swept for years, greeting the merchants who knew him only as the polite janitor. None of them could imagine the transformation they would witness that day. The courtroom filled quickly. The 3 fired waiters were present with their families, anxious for justice. On the opposite side, Marcus arrived with his entourage of lawyers, exuding confidence and arrogance. He greeted important acquaintances, laughed loudly, made sure to demonstrate that all this was just a minor annoyance in his privileged life. "It'll be resolved in an hour," he commented with a mocking smile. When the bailiff announced the magistrate's entrance, everyone stood respectfully. Marcus adjusted his tie, prepared to impress another corrupt judge. But when the door opened and Robert Thompson entered wearing the black robe of the judiciary, walking with the dignity he had always possessed, now amplified by the authority of office, Marcus's blood froze in his veins. The recognition was instantaneous and devastating. There was the man he had humiliated, thrown out like an animal, pushed into the cold rain. The dirty and despised janitor now occupied the highest chair in that tribunal, wielding the power to decide his fate. Marcus's legs trembled, his mouth went dry, and for the first time in his life he felt the true meaning of the word terror. Robert sat in the judge's chair with the same serenity with which he swept the streets. His eyes surveyed the courtroom, passed over the lawyers, the court officers, the waiters seeking justice, and finally rested on Marcus. For the briefest instant, a flash of recognition crossed his gaze, but it was soon replaced by the absolute impartiality of justice. He wasn't there as the humiliated janitor. He was there as a magistrate, guardian of the law, servant of truth. "I declare the session open," said Robert with a firm and clear voice. We proceed to case number 2024.001.245.387, labor action filed by Messrs. John Wilson, Peter Davis, and Mary Johnson against the commercial establishment Sterling's, represented by owner Marcus Sterling. The trial began with reading the complaint. The accusations were serious and detailed: 14-hour workdays without breaks, payment below minimum wage, constant humiliations, threats of dismissal, hostile work environment, and a series of labor violations that painted the picture of a truly cruel employer. Robert listened to every word with absolute attention, making precise notes, his latent legal experience awakening like a river returning to its natural course. When it came time for testimonies, truth emerged like water sprouting from parched earth. John Wilson, a 50-year-old man with 3 children to support, tearfully recounted how he was forced to work even when sick, how Marcus called him useless in front of customers, how he had to beg for his own rights. Peter Davis revealed he was forced to clean the bathroom with his bare hands, without gloves or proper products, because Marcus said poor people don't deserve protection. Mary Johnson, a 60-year-old woman, narrated how she was fired when she asked for time off to care for her sick grandson, being called a worthless old woman who should die to make room for young people. With each testimony, Robert felt indignation grow in his chest, but maintained his exterior serenity. He intimately knew that type of humiliation, understood what it meant to be treated as less than human by people who considered themselves superior. But his mission there wasn't personal revenge, it was to deliver justice for all humble workers who suffered in silence. Marcus, visibly nervous, tried to communicate with his lawyers through desperate whispers. "You didn't tell me the judge was that janitor," he hissed between his teeth. "He's going to destroy me." His lawyers, equally surprised, tried to maintain composure, but knew the situation had become drastically complicated. When it came time for the defense, the arguments sounded empty and desperate. They tried to discredit the workers, questioned their memories, insinuated that everything was just revenge for justified dismissals. But the evidence was overwhelming: irregular pay stubs, witnesses among customers who had witnessed the humiliations, medical records of employees who became ill from stress, and even recordings secretly made by a brave employee. It was then that Robert asked to hear Marcus himself. The businessman stood up on shaky legs, went to the center of the courtroom, and swore to tell the truth. His answers were evasive, full of contradictions, pathetic attempts to justify the unjustifiable. He spoke as if he were the victim of the situation, as if the employees were the real villains of the story. Then came the moment that would define everything. Robert leaned forward and asked the question that cut through the air like a blade. "Mr. Marcus Sterling, do you believe that all people, regardless of their profession or social condition, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect?" Marcus stammered, tried to elaborate a politically correct answer, but his words sounded false and calculated. It was obvious he didn't believe what he was saying, that his entire life had been built on contempt for the less fortunate. It was then that Robert spoke the words that would echo forever in the memory of everyone present. "Mr. Sterling, during this hearing, I've heard reports of cruelty that would wound any human heart. Honest workers, who built with their hands the empire you inherited, were treated like animals. Dignified men and women were humiliated, their families despised, their humanity denied. And most seriously, you show no remorse for your actions." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Marcus was pale, trembling, completely disarmed before Robert's moral and legal authority. Everyone present realized they were witnessing something extraordinary, true justice being applied by someone who intimately knew the pain of humiliation. What an incredible moment. Leave your comment saying what you thought of this plot twist. Robert continued, his voice gaining strength and solemnity. American labor law is not just a set of technical rules. It is the materialization of a fundamental principle, the dignity of human work. Every article, every paragraph, every comma was written with the blood and sweat of those who fought so that no worker would be treated as a slave in their own homeland. He stood up, his imposing figure completely dominating the environment. Based on the evidence presented, the witnesses heard, and the implicit confession of the defendant himself, I declare the labor action fully justified. I condemn the establishment Sterling's to pay $200,000 in collective moral damages, $50,000 to each plaintiff for individual moral damages, in addition to all due labor benefits with interest and monetary correction. The hammer of justice came down forcefully on the table, sealing Marcus's fate. But Robert wasn't finished yet. I also order the immediate closure of the establishment until improvements in working conditions are proven, according to a technical report from the Department of Labor. The deadline for payment of compensation is 30 days, under penalty of seizure of all the defendant's assets. Marcus collapsed in his chair, completely destroyed. In a matter of minutes, he had lost everything: the restaurant, the money, his reputation, his future. His lawyers tried to console him by talking about appeals, but everyone knew the sentence was unappealable in facts, built on legal foundations solid as rock. The three waiters cried with emotion, hugging each other and their families. Finally, after years of humiliation, justice had been served. John Wilson approached Robert with tears in his eyes. "Thank you so much, Your Honor. You gave us back our dignity." But the most important lesson was yet to come. With the courtroom already emptying, Robert called Marcus for a private conversation in his chambers. The ruined businessman approached with faltering steps, fearing even more humiliations. "Mr. Sterling," said Robert with a serene voice, "I'm sure you recognized me." Marcus nodded, unable to speak. "2 weeks ago, you threw me out of your restaurant like I was a stray dog. You said people like me should eat garbage from dumpsters. You laughed at my condition, mocked my dignity, pushed me into the cold dawn rain." Marcus began to cry, not from sadness, but from deep shame and belated regret. "But I want you to know," Robert continued, "that my sentence wasn't motivated by personal revenge. Every word I spoke was based exclusively on law and justice. If you had treated your employees with dignity, if you had honored your labor commitments, if you had shown a minimum of humanity, the result would have been different, regardless of what happened between us." Robert approached the window, looking at the street where he had spent 3 decades sweeping. "Do you know what's the difference between us, Mr. Sterling? You always judged people by their clothes, their cars, their bank accounts. I learned, sweeping these streets for 30 years, that a man's true measure lies in his actions, his integrity, in how he treats those who can do nothing for him." Marcus finally found words, between sobs. I didn't know. Forgive me, Your Honor, forgive me." "Forgiveness," said Robert, turning to him, "is something you must seek mainly from those you caused pain. I already forgave you the moment you humiliated me, because holding grudges would diminish my own dignity. But forgiveness doesn't nullify the consequences of our actions. Justice has been served, and it's bigger than both of us." Marcus left the courthouse a broken man, but perhaps for the first time in his life, truly human. In the following months, he would sell his luxury goods to pay the compensations, learn to live with less, and begin working as a waiter in a small restaurant in the suburbs. There, initially treated with the same arrogance he had shown others, he would begin to understand firsthand the meaning of humility. Dr. Henry Morrison, the presiding judge, would receive news of the sentence in his hospital bed. For the first time in decades, a sincere smile would illuminate his tired face. He had spent 40 years watching justice be bought, sold, and manipulated. Now, in his final days of life, he witnessed proof that there were still men of integrity willing to defend the humble. He would die a week later in peace, knowing he left the world a little better. Robert would return to the streets, no longer as a janitor, but as the most respected interim judge in the county. He would continue living in the same modest house, driving the same old car, greeting the same neighbors. But now he would carry with him the certainty that the lost time hadn't been in vain. Every day sweeping streets had been a lesson in humility that prepared him for that supreme moment of justice. John Wilson, Peter Davis, and Mary Johnson would use the compensation money to fulfill simple dreams. John would pay for his youngest son's college. Peter would pay for the surgery his wife had needed for years, and Mary would buy a small house where she could raise her grandchildren with dignity. More important than money, however, was the restoration of their self-esteem. They began to believe again that justice still existed in the world. The story spread through the city like a fire of hope. The janitor who became a judge, the humble man who defeated arrogance, the victory of the small against the powerful. On the streets Robert had swept for 3 decades, people now greeted him with doubled respect, not for the position he held, but for the example of dignity he had always given. And so we learn that life has a mysterious way of balancing the books. Those who humiliate the humble, who despise the simple, who believe they're superior because of their possessions, may discover that destiny holds bitter surprises. On the other hand, those who maintain their dignity even in the most adverse circumstances, who treat everyone with respect regardless of their condition, who honor honest work even when despised, may see life return double the honor they preserved. True nobility isn't in the palaces we inhabit, but in the hearts we cultivate. Real superiority isn't measured by zeros in bank accounts, but by the capacity to see humanity in every person we encounter. And justice, that powerful and mysterious force, has its own ways of manifesting, often through the most unexpected hands, wearing the robe of truth over the shoulders of those who never lost their integrity. In Millbrook, even today, when someone tries to humiliate an honest worker, the elders whisper, "Be careful, you might be talking to the judge who will decide your fate." And in this small city, where everyone knows each other by sight but few truly know each other, people learn that every human being carries within themselves a unique story, untouchable dignity, and perhaps a power we could never imagine. This is the story of Robert Thompson, the janitor who became a judge, the man who proved that justice may be delayed, but never fails, especially when wielded by hands that know the true value of humility and human dignity. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, hit that like button, and share in the comments which moment moved you the most. Stories like this remind us that goodness and justice still exist in this world, and that each of us can make a difference, no matter what our profession or social condition may be.